I never thought a spreadsheet would change my life, but there I was at 2 in the morning, staring at line items that made my blood run cold. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the receipts I'd accidentally stumbled upon while digging through the HOA's financial records that had been mistakenly CC'd to me instead of Sharon McNally, our treasurer. My name is Stephen Douglas, and I'd lived in the Meadowbrook Estates community in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 years. It was one of those planned neighborhoods where every house looked vaguely similar. The lawns had to be exactly 2.5 inches tall, and the HOA board ruled with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive emails. I'd always paid my dues on time, kept my head down, and tried to avoid the wrath of Brenda Patterson, our HOA president and the living embodiment of every neighborhood nightmare you've ever heard about. Brenda was 52, drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked diagonally across 2 spots at the community center, and had blonde highlights that looked like they'd been applied with a paintbrush in the dark. She wore athleisure constantly despite never actually exercising, and her voice had this particular pitch that could shatter glass when she was upset about someone's unauthorized patio furniture. The email had arrived on a Tuesday evening. Subject line: Q2, Financial Summary Confidential. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but then I noticed it was from our HOA management company. The attachment was a detailed breakdown of where our quarterly dues were going. We paid $600 every 3 months, which seemed steep for a neighborhood that had a small pool, a barely functional gym, and a clubhouse that smelled like old carpet. I opened the PDF out of curiosity more than anything else. Landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, legal fees, all the usual suspects were there. But then I scrolled down to a section labeled Administrative Expenses, and that's when things got weird. There were regular charges to something called Executive Wellness Retreat, totaling $5,000 per quarter. Another line item read Presidential Conference Maui for $12,000. And then the kicker, a recurring annual expense labeled Leadership Development Seminar Cabo San Lucas for $28,000. I sat back in my chair, my coffee going cold beside me. Our HOA had maybe 200 homes. Even with our inflated dues, these expenses were eating up a massive chunk of the budget. I pulled up my own records and started doing math. If everyone paid the same amount I did, we were bringing in roughly $480,000 annually. These retreats and conferences were consuming nearly $50,000 of that. I needed more information. The next morning, I sent a polite email to the HOA management company requesting detailed receipts for the administrative expenses. I got back a form letter saying that financial details were only available to board members and that I should direct my concerns to the board president. Right. Brenda Patterson. The woman who'd once threatened to fine me $200 because my garbage can was visible from the street for 15 minutes past the designated pickup time. I wasn't going to get anywhere with her without ammunition. That's when I remembered that Marcus, my neighbor 3 doors down, had mentioned his wife Whitney worked for a hotel chain. I walked over that evening and found Marcus grilling burgers in his backyard, carefully positioned on the HOA-approved concrete pad that had cost him $3,000 to install after Brenda declared his previous grass-level grilling setup a fire hazard. "Stephen, hey man, want a burger?" Marcus called out, waving his spatula. "Actually, I need a favor," I said, hopping the low fence between our yards. "Your wife still work for Hilton?" "Yeah, she's a regional manager now." "Why?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot of the Cabo expense. Can she look up if there was a group booking under Meadowbrook Estates HOA or Brenda Patterson's name in Cabo around March of last year? Marcus squinted at the screen, his expression shifting from confused to angry in real time. Are you kidding me? Is this where our dues are going? That's what I'm trying to find out. Whitney came home an hour later, and by 9 o'clock that night, I had my first real evidence. She'd found a booking at the Hilton Los Cabos Beach and Golf Resort for Brenda Patterson and 3 guests, a 4-night stay in a luxury suite during spring break. The total bill came to just over $26,000 when you included the spa treatments, golf outings, and room service charges. The reservation was made through a corporate account, Whitney explained, showing me the printout she'd risked her job to get. See here. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, with a note that it was for a board leadership conference. Was there actually a conference? I asked. Not that we hosted. And I checked with the other resorts in the area. No HOA conventions, no leadership seminars, nothing even close during those dates. I felt my hands shaking. She just took a vacation and charged it to the HOA. Looks like it, Whitney said. And if this is recent, she's probably been doing it for years. Over the next 2 weeks, I became obsessed. I filed a formal request under Arizona's planned community statutes, which required HOAs to provide financial records to homeowners. Brenda responded with a letter from the HOA's attorney stating that I'd receive the records within 30 days and would be charged a reasonable copying fee of $250. I paid it, fuming the whole time. When the records arrived, they were deliberately disorganized. Receipts were out of order, some were photocopied so poorly they were barely legible, and entire months seemed to be missing. But I'm a software engineer. I know my way around data. I spent every evening for a week scanning, organizing, and cross-referencing every document. The pattern became clear. Every year for the past 5 years, Brenda had taken what she called leadership development trips. Cabo in March, Maui in July, Aspen in December. Sometimes she brought her husband, sometimes her adult daughter, and once she'd apparently brought her sister and brother-in-law. All of it charged to the HOA under vague categories like board education or executive training. But it got worse. The executive wellness retreat charges were monthly spa visits to a luxury resort in Scottsdale. Every single month, Brenda and usually one other board member would spend an entire day getting massages, facials, and expensive lunches, all billed as stress management for volunteer leadership. I calculated that over 5 years, Brenda had personally benefited from approximately $230,000 of HOA funds for her personal vacations and spa days. I needed to tell someone, but I also needed to be smart about it. If I went public too soon, Brenda would circle the wagons and I'd be the crazy neighbor making wild accusations. I needed allies. I started with Thomas and Linda Chen, a retired couple who'd been fighting with the HOA for months over their request to install solar panels. Brenda had denied it on aesthetic grounds, despite Arizona law actually protecting homeowners' rights to solar installations. They were already frustrated with her, so they'd be receptive. "This is fraud," Thomas said flatly, looking through the documentation I'd laid out on their dining room table. "This is actual criminal fraud. We need to take this to the other homeowners," Linda added. "Call a special meeting. The bylaws allow for homeowners to petition for one if we get signatures from 20% of the community. We needed 40 signatures." I printed out a simple petition stating that we were requesting a special meeting to discuss financial irregularities and review of the budget. I didn't mention the specifics yet. No need to give Brenda advance warning. Going door to door in Phoenix in May was brutal. The temperature was already hitting 105 degrees by mid-afternoon, but I walked the neighborhood every evening, knocking on doors and making my pitch. Some people slammed the door in my face. Others were afraid of retaliation from Brenda. But enough people were fed up with the increasingly expensive dues and Brenda's petty tyranny that I had my 40 signatures in 4 days. I submitted the petition to the management company on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing. I let it go to voicemail. Brenda's voice was shrill even through the tiny speaker. "Stephen Douglas, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is completely inappropriate. The board operates in full transparency, and your little petition is nothing more than a witch hunt. I'm considering legal action for harassment and defamation. Call me back immediately." I didn't call back. Instead, I sent a polite email to the entire board, CCing the management company, stating that I looked forward to the special meeting and would be preparing a presentation on financial management best practices for HOAs. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which gave me time to build an airtight case. Whitney helped me get records from 2 more hotels. Marcus, who worked in accounting, helped me create a clear visual presentation showing the money flow. The Chens spread the word through the neighborhood, and suddenly people were paying attention. Then Brenda made her first major mistake. She sent out an email to all residents claiming that I was a troublemaker trying to destabilize the community, and that the special meeting was a waste of time organized by someone who didn't understand the complexities of HOA management. She urged everyone to ignore it. The email backfired spectacularly. People don't like being told what to think, and Brenda's condescending tone made even her supporters uncomfortable. I started getting emails from homeowners asking what I'd found and offering to help. One of those emails was from Rachel, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. She'd been quietly annoyed with Brenda for years and saw an opportunity. "I can't give you legal advice," she said when we met at a coffee shop in Temp, "but I can tell you that what you're describing sounds like embezzlement. In Arizona, that's a Class 2 felony if the amount exceeds $25,000. Your evidence suggests way more than that." "Should I go to the police?" I asked. "Not yet. You need the HOA to acknowledge the problem first. If you go to police now, Brenda's lawyer will claim it's a civil dispute over expense reimbursement policies, and it'll get messy. But if the HOA votes to investigate and she refuses to cooperate or can't provide justification, that's when you involve law enforcement." The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through my presentation, checking the numbers, making sure every receipt was matched to a bank statement. I'd found even more evidence, including emails from Brenda to the management company explicitly instructing them to categorize her vacation expenses under educational and administrative budgets. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. I'd expected maybe 50 people to show up. Over 130 residents packed into the space, standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. The air conditioning was struggling, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Brenda sat at the front table with the other 4 board members. Sharon McNally, the treasurer who always looked terrified. Dave Richmond, a yes man who did whatever Brenda wanted. Patricia Wells, who seemed permanently confused. And Greg Torres, the only board member who occasionally pushed back on Brenda's more outrageous proposals. "This meeting is now called to order," Brenda announced, banging a gavel like she was a judge. "We're here because Stephen Douglas has made some vague accusations about financial management, and the bylaws require us to hold this circus. Stephen, you have 15 minutes. "I'll need at least 30, I said, setting up my laptop and projector. 15, Brenda snapped. The bylaws actually don't specify a time limit for presentations at special meetings, Greg Torres interjected, reading from his own copy. Let's give him 30 and see what he has to say. Brenda's face turned red, but she waved her hand dismissively. Fine. Make it quick. I took a breath and started. The first slide was simple, a pie chart showing where our HOA dues were supposed to go according to the annual budget Brenda presented each year. Landscaping, maintenance, insurance, reserves, administrative costs. This is what we were told, I said. Reasonable expenses for running a community of 200 homes. But when I requested detailed financial records, which is my right under Arizona law, I found something very different. The next slide showed the actual breakdown, with the bloated administrative expenses highlighted in red. There was an audible gasp from the crowd. Over the past 5 years, approximately $230,000 of HOA funds have been used to pay for luxury vacations, spa treatments, and resort stays for our board president and her guests. These expenses were categorized as leadership development, executive training, and administrative necessities. I clicked to the next slide, showing a receipt from the Cabo Resort. Brenda's name was clearly visible, along with the itemized charges: premium suite, golf lessons, deep tissue massage, lobster dinners. This is defamation, Brenda shouted, jumping to her feet. Those were legitimate board education expenses. Then you won't mind explaining which educational seminar you attended that included couples spa packages and parasailing lessons, I replied calmly, clicking to another receipt. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Someone yelled "thief," and others joined in. Brenda tried to restore order, banging her gavel frantically, but the crowd wasn't having it. Everyone calmed down. Greg Torres finally bellowed, standing up. He turned to Brenda. Brenda, I had no idea about these expenses. You need to provide documentation showing these were legitimate HOA business expenses, right now. I don't have to justify myself to a mob, Brenda shot back. The board approved all of these expenditures. I never saw these, Sharon said quietly, her voice shaking. You told me they were for conferences and I signed off, but I never saw the actual receipts. Dave Richmond was staring at his hands, clearly realizing he'd rubber-stamped fraud for years. Patricia looked like she might cry. I continued with my presentation, showing slide after slide of evidence. Hotel bookings that coincided with Brenda's Facebook posts, showing her on the beach. Credit card statements from the HOA account showing charges at luxury restaurants in Maui on dates when there were no HOA conferences anywhere in Hawaii. Emails where Brenda instructed the management company to reimburse her for team-building exercises that were actually wine tastings in Napa. By the time I finished, the room was in chaos. People were demanding Brenda's immediate resignation. Others wanted their money back. Several were already talking about lawsuits. I motioned that we immediately suspend Brenda Patterson from all board duties pending an independent audit, Thomas Chen announced, standing up. Second, called out at least a dozen voices. That's not how this works, Brenda sputtered. You can't just vote me out. I'm elected until next year's annual meeting. Rachel, the paralegal, stood up. Actually, the bylaws allow for removal of board members for cause with a 2/3 vote of the membership present at a properly noticed meeting. This qualifies. All in favor of removing Brenda Patterson from the board immediately? Greg Torres asked, apparently deciding to take charge. The show of hands was overwhelming. Only 3 people didn't raise their hands, and I was pretty sure 2 of them were Brenda's adult children who'd shown up to support her. "This is illegal," Brenda hissed, grabbing her purse. "My lawyer will destroy all of you." "Your lawyer might want to focus on keeping you out of prison," I said, "because embezzlement of over $200,000 is a Class 2 felony in Arizona." That stopped her cold. The color drained from her face. I was going to pay it back. These were advances against my compensation as president. "The president position is unpaid," Greg said. "It always has been. That's in the bylaws you supposedly read." Brenda looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time how serious this was. "I've given 5 years of my life to this community. Do you know how stressful it is? How thankless? I deserved some compensation for my time." "Then you should have proposed a salary and let the community vote on it," Marcus called out from the back. "You don't just steal money and call it compensation." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. The remaining board members agreed to resign, acknowledging they'd failed in their oversight duties. A temporary emergency board was established, with Greg Torres, Thomas Chen, and 3 other homeowners who had financial or legal backgrounds. Their first order of business was to hire a forensic accountant and file a police report. I got home after midnight, exhausted but wired on adrenaline. My phone buzzed with a text from Whitney. "You did it. Everyone's talking about it." But I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't going to go quietly, and there were legal processes that would take months or even years to fully resolve. The next morning, I woke to find my garbage cans tipped over across my driveway, trash strewn everywhere. A coincidence? Maybe, but probably not. The temporary board moved quickly. Within a week, they'd hired Patterson and Associates, a forensic accounting firm out of Scottsdale. I met with their lead investigator, a sharp woman named Victoria who looked like she could spot a fraudulent expense report from a mile away. "This is pretty clear-cut," she said after I walked her through my findings. "But we need to establish intent and trace every dollar to make sure the police and prosecutors have everything they need. It'll take about 6 weeks." While the investigation proceeded, the neighborhood was buzzing with energy. People who'd never come to HOA meetings before were suddenly engaged. We held weekly updates at the clubhouse, and attendance was consistently over 100 people. Brenda, meanwhile, had lawyered up. Her attorney, a slick guy named Richard Morrison, sent the HOA a letter claiming that all expenses were legitimate, properly approved, and that any attempt to seek reimbursement or involve law enforcement would result in a defamation lawsuit against me personally and the HOA collectively. "Let him try," Rachel told me. "Truth is an absolute defense to defamation. You have receipts, literally." The forensic audit came back 6 weeks later, and it was worse than I'd thought. The total amount Brenda had embezzled was actually closer to $315,000 when you included expenses I'd missed. Furniture she'd bought for her home office and charged to the HOA. A new laptop and iPad Pro she'd claimed were for HOA business but kept for personal use. And even her monthly car payment for 2 years, which she'd categorized as transportation for community inspections. Victoria presented the findings to the temporary board and then to the full community at a special meeting. This time, the local news showed up. Someone had tipped them off, and suddenly we had cameras from 3 different Phoenix stations filming outside the clubhouse. I gave a brief interview, keeping it factual. We discovered that our HOA president had been using community funds for personal expenses over a period of 5 years. We've conducted a thorough investigation and will be cooperating fully with law enforcement. The story ran that night on all 3 stations and was picked up by the Arizona Republic the next day. The headline read, "Phoenix HOA president accused of embezzling over $300K for luxury vacations." By the end of the week, it had gone viral online. HOA horror story websites picked it up, and suddenly, I was getting interview requests from podcasters and YouTube channels. I declined most of them, but I did agree to talk to a local investigative reporter named Jennifer Kim, who'd done a series on HOA fraud across the state. She met me at her restaurant in Phoenix and brought her own file of similar cases. "This happens more than people think," she explained. "HOAs operate with minimal oversight, especially smaller ones like yours. Board members have access to significant funds and often no real accounting experience or checks on their authority. It's a perfect setup for embezzlement." "How many cases are we talking about?" I asked. "In Arizona alone, at least a dozen major cases in the past 5 years that resulted in criminal charges. Probably hundreds more that never got reported because homeowners didn't know their rights or were afraid of retaliation." Her story ran the following Sunday as a front-page feature, using our case as the centerpiece of a larger investigation into HOA financial mismanagement. The article included interviews with legal experts, other victims, and even a state legislator who was proposing new oversight requirements for HOAs. That Monday, I got a call from Detective Sarah Williams of the Phoenix Police Department's White Collar Crimes Unit. She wanted to meet and go over the evidence. We sat in an interview room at the precinct and I walked her through everything: the initial discovery, the financial records, the forensic audit, all of it. She took notes and asked pointed questions. "This is solid," she said finally. "We'll need to subpoena the bank records and interview the other board members, but I don't see any reason we won't be moving forward with charges. The amount and the duration make this a serious felony." "How long does that take?" I asked. "Depends on the prosecutor's office, but probably a few months to build the case properly. We want to make sure it's airtight." I left the police station feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. This was really happening. Brenda Patterson was going to face criminal charges because I'd opened an email that wasn't meant for me and actually read the fine print. Brenda's response to the police investigation was to go on the offensive. Her lawyer held a press conference claiming that she was the victim of a vindictive neighbor who'd manipulated financial records and orchestrated a coup. He produced emails showing that the board had approved various administrative expenses over the years, arguing that this proved everything was legitimate. The board approved categories of spending. Greg Torres responded in his own statement. "We never approved specific luxury vacations." Mrs. Patterson deliberately obscured the nature of these expenses. The legal maneuvering continued for months. Brenda filed a lawsuit against me for defamation and against the HOA for wrongful removal from the board. Her lawyer argued that even if the expenses were inappropriate, they didn't rise to the level of criminal embezzlement because she'd had authorization to spend money on administrative costs. The prosecutor's office wasn't buying it. In October, 7 months after my initial discovery, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office filed formal charges against Brenda Patterson. 15 counts of fraudulent schemes and artifices, a Class II felony, and 5 counts of theft for amounts exceeding $25,000. I was sitting in my home office when I got the news from Detective Williams. "She's being arraigned tomorrow morning. Just wanted to give you a heads up in case the media reaches out." They did. My phone rang off the hook for 2 days. I gave a simple statement. I'm grateful that law enforcement took this seriously. No one is above the law, and HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to the community they serve. Brenda's arraignment was brief. She pleaded not guilty, posted a $50,000 bond, and walked out of the courthouse surrounded by her family. Her lawyer told reporters they'd fight the charges vigorously, and that Brenda was a pillar of the community being railroaded by an angry mob. The criminal case moved slowly through the system. Pre-trial motions, discovery disputes, continuances. Meanwhile, the HOA held new elections and a completely fresh board was voted in. I was asked to run but declined. I'd done my part, and honestly, I was exhausted. The new board was competent and transparent. They implemented new financial controls, including requiring 2 signatures on all checks over $500, quarterly financial reports posted online, and an annual independent audit. They also filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda, seeking restitution for the full amount she'd embezzled plus legal fees. Brenda's homeowner's insurance denied coverage, arguing that intentional criminal acts weren't covered under her policy. Her personal assets were limited, her house was mortgaged to the hilt, and her husband worked a normal job as a middle manager. There wasn't $300,000 to recover, even if we won in civil court. We'll probably get pennies on the dollar, the HOA's new attorney explained at a board meeting. But it's important to pursue it anyway, both for justice and to send a message. The criminal trial was scheduled for March, almost a year after my initial discovery. I was listed as a witness, along with the forensic accountant, several hotel employees who could verify Brenda's stays, and the other former board members. 2 weeks before trial, Brenda's lawyer reached out to the prosecutor about a plea deal. The details were kept confidential initially, but Detective Williams gave me a heads up that something was in the works. She's looking at serious prison time if convicted on all counts, she explained. Multiple Class 2 felonies could mean 10 years or more. My guess is she'll plead to reduce charges in exchange for restitution and a lighter sentence. The plea agreement was announced on a Friday afternoon. Brenda Patterson pled guilty to 1 count of fraudulent schemes and 3 counts of theft. In exchange for her guilty plea, the prosecution recommended 4 years in prison with the possibility of early release after 2 years for good behavior, plus an order to pay full restitution of $315,000. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Thomas and Linda Chen, Marcus and Whitney, and about 20 other homeowners who'd followed the case from the beginning. Brenda's lawyer made an impassioned plea for leniency. He talked about her years of community service, her clean record prior to this, the stress she'd been under managing the HOA as a volunteer. He argued that prison time was unnecessary and that supervised probation with restitution would serve justice better. The prosecutor wasn't sympathetic. She walked through the years of systematic theft, the elaborate lies Brenda had told to cover her tracks, and the violation of trust she'd committed against her neighbors. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, the prosecutor said. This was a calculated scheme that went on for 5 years. Mrs. Patterson had numerous opportunities to stop, to come clean, to make things right. She chose not to. She chose to continue stealing from her neighbors, from people who trusted her with their hard-earned money. Then it was time for victim impact statements. Thomas Chen went first, describing how he and Linda were on a fixed retirement income, and how the inflated HOA dues had forced them to cut back on medications and visits to see their grandchildren. A single mother named Jessica talked about how she'd struggled to pay the dues while raising 2 kids alone, never knowing that her money was funding someone else's luxury vacations. I went last. I stood at the podium and looked directly at Brenda, who was staring at the table in front of her. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I am angry. You had a position of trust and you abused it. You made our community a worse place to live, and you did it while acting like you were doing us a favor. I hope you understand the impact of what you've done, and I hope this sentence serves as a deterrent to anyone else who thinks they can treat HOA funds like a personal piggy bank. The judge, a stern woman named Elizabeth Morrison who'd been on the bench for 20 years, took a short recess before delivering her sentence. When she returned, she didn't mince words. "Mrs. Patterson, you violated one of the most fundamental responsibilities we have to our neighbors and our community. You stole from people who trusted you, and you did it systematically and without remorse until you were caught. The court sentences you to 3.5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, with credit for time served. You will also be required to pay full restitution of $315,000, with a payment plan to be determined by the probation office. Upon release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation." Brenda started crying, her shoulders shaking. Her husband, sitting in the front row, put his head in his hands. The bailiff led her away, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. I gave a brief statement thanking the prosecutor's office and the police for taking the case seriously. Jennifer Kim, the investigative reporter who'd covered the story from the beginning, caught up with me as I was walking to my car. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Honestly, tired," I said, "but also relieved. This needed to happen, not just for our community, but to send a message that this kind of thing won't be tolerated." What's next for Meadowbrook Estates? Rebuilding trust, making sure we have systems in place so this never happens again. And honestly, just getting back to being a normal neighborhood where the biggest controversy is what color someone paints their mailbox. She laughed. "Good luck with that." The civil case was resolved a few months later. Brenda had no realistic ability to pay $300,000, so the settlement was structured as a lien against her house and a garnishment of any wages she earned after her release from prison. The HOA would probably recover maybe $20,000 or $30,000 over the next decade if we were lucky. It wasn't justice in a financial sense, but it was something. Life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The new board was boring in the best possible way, competent and transparent, but not interested in drama. Dues were actually lowered slightly once we eliminated the bloated administrative expenses and renegotiated some contracts. I became something of a neighborhood celebrity for a while, which was weird and uncomfortable. People would stop me at the pool or the mailbox to thank me for speaking up. A few national news outlets reached out about doing stories, and I even got a call from a producer working on a documentary about HOA fraud. The Arizona legislature actually passed new oversight requirements for HOAs partly because of our case. All HOAs with more than 50 homes now have to conduct annual independent audits and make detailed financial reports available to homeowners within 30 days of request at no charge. Board members have to take a basic financial management class. It's not perfect, but it's something. I testified before a state legislative committee about HOA reform, which was surreal. Me, a software engineer who just wanted to understand where his dues were going, suddenly testifying in front of elected officials about the need for better accountability in planned communities. The problem is that most homeowners don't pay attention until something goes wrong, I told the committee. We trust that board members are acting in good faith, and most of them are. But the system needs safeguards for when someone like Brenda Patterson comes along. Transparency, oversight, and meaningful consequences for fraud. The law passed with bipartisan support and was signed by the governor in a ceremony I was invited to attend. It felt like the culmination of a bizarre journey that started with a misrouted email. Brenda served 20 months in prison before being granted early release for good behavior. By that time, she and her husband had divorced, her kids barely spoke to her, and she'd become a cautionary tale in HOA management circles. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Texas after her release, wanting a fresh start away from the community she'd betrayed. I never spoke to her again after the sentencing hearing. Part of me wondered if she'd ever really understood the impact of what she'd done, or if she still saw herself as the victim of an ungrateful community. 2 years after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my back patio on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading the news on my tablet. The neighborhood was quiet, kids riding bikes in the street, someone mowing their lawn a few houses down, normal suburban sounds. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Board meeting agenda posted. Most boring one in years. We've made it. I smiled and texted back. That's the dream, right? Boring HOA meetings. Looking back, I never planned to become the guy who took down a corrupt HOA president. I just wanted to understand why my dues were so high and where the money was going. But that's how these things happen, usually. Someone asks a question, pulls on a thread, and suddenly the whole thing unravels. The experience taught me a lot about community, accountability, and the importance of actually reading the financial documents you're sent, even when they seem boring and dense. It taught me that most people want to do the right thing, but need someone to take the first step and show them it's possible to challenge authority when that authority is abusing its power. It also taught me that HOAs, for all their faults and frustrations, are ultimately just groups of people trying to manage shared resources. And like any human system, they're only as good as the people running them and the oversight keeping them honest. Whitney and Marcus moved away last year. His job transferred him to Denver. We stayed in touch, and he still jokes that he's glad his new neighborhood has almost no HOA at all. The Chens are still here, finally got their solar panels installed, and have become advocates for sustainable living in the community. Greg Torres is still on the board, providing continuity and institutional knowledge that's actually helpful instead of corrupt. As for me, I'm still in the same house, still paying my HOA dues, still attending the occasional meeting when something interesting comes up. The difference is that now I actually trust where the money is going. The quarterly financial reports are detailed and clear. The board answers questions promptly and thoroughly. It's what it should have been all along. Sometimes I think about that night when I opened that email by mistake, the moment that set everything in motion. What would have happened if it had gone to the right person? Sharon probably would have filed it away without really looking at it. Brenda would have continued her scheme for who knows how many more years. The community would have kept paying inflated dues to fund someone else's luxury lifestyle, never knowing the truth. There's something almost random about it. How one small accident, one misrouted email, can expose years of fraud and change the trajectory of hundreds of people's lives. It makes you think about all the other small corruptions happening in plain sight, hidden in spreadsheets and line items that most people never question. I got a LinkedIn message a few months ago from someone in a neighborhood in California dealing with a similar situation. Their HOA president had been using community funds for personal expenses, and they'd seen the news coverage of our case. They wanted advice on how to proceed. I spent an hour on the phone with them, walking through the steps, documentation, evidence gathering, understanding your legal rights, building community support. It felt good to help, to know that speaking up had created a template others could follow. The hardest part is taking that first step, I told them. Once you start asking questions and demanding answers, things happen fast. But you have to be prepared for retaliation, for people to call you a troublemaker, for it to get ugly before it gets better. Was it worth it? They asked. I thought about that for a moment. The stress, the late nights, the garbage cans tipped over in my driveway, the lawsuit threats, all of it. And then I thought about the $315,000 that would have continued disappearing, the families struggling to pay inflated dues, the complete lack of accountability that had become normal. Yeah, I said, it was absolutely worth it. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't really about Brenda Patterson or luxury vacations or even the money. It was about the principle that people in positions of trust have responsibilities, and when they violate that trust, there have to be consequences. It was about a community finding its voice and demanding better. It was about the idea that you don't have to accept things just because that's how they've always been done. That asking questions is not just your right but your responsibility. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply pay attention and speak up when something doesn't add up. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates, still walk my dog through the neighborhood every evening, still wave to neighbors and make small talk by the mailboxes. But now I know that beneath the surface of perfectly manicured lawns and HOA-approved paint colors, there are real people trying to make things work. And sometimes those people need someone to believe that change is possible. That first email, arriving on a Tuesday evening, changed everything. Not because I was looking for a fight or had some vendetta against the HOA, but because I was willing to look at the numbers and ask a simple question. Does this make sense? The answer was no. And once I accepted that, once I decided to follow the evidence wherever it led, everything else followed. The investigation, the community meetings, the police reports, the trial, the conviction, all of it flowed from that one decision to not look away from something that didn't add up. 3 years later, I sometimes still get recognized when I'm out in Phoenix. "Hey, you're that HOA guy," someone will say at the grocery store or a restaurant. Usually they want to share their own HOA horror story, and I listen politely, offering advice when I can. The documentary about HOA fraud that featured our case came out last year. It was strange watching myself on screen, talking about spreadsheets and receipts, but the filmmaker did a good job showing how common these problems are and how little oversight exists in many communities. My life has mostly returned to normal. I work, I spend time with friends, I maintain my house to HOA standards without resentment now that I know the money is being used appropriately. The whole experience feels almost surreal when I think back on it, like it happened to someone else. But every quarter when I write that check for HOA dues, I think about where it's going. I review the financial statements when they're posted. I attend enough meetings to stay informed. I'll never take it for granted again. And I'll never assume that people in positions of authority are automatically trustworthy just because they volunteer for the role. Brenda Patterson stole over $300,000 from her neighbors over 5 years, funding luxury vacations while people struggled to pay their bills. She did it by exploiting trust and taking advantage of a system with inadequate oversight. She got caught because of a misrouted email and a neighbor who was willing to ask uncomfortable questions. That's my story. It's not heroic or dramatic in the traditional sense. I didn't save anyone's life or stop a violent crime. But I helped hold someone accountable for betraying the trust of an entire community. And in doing so, maybe made things a little bit better for the next person in a similar situation. The sun is setting now, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. My neighborhood looks peaceful, almost idyllic, And for the most part, it is. Because sometimes boring is exactly what you want from your HOA. No drama, no scandal, no shocking revelations hidden in the financial records. Just a community of people pooling resources to maintain common areas, following transparent processes, and trusting that the people managing those resources are doing so honestly and with everyone's best interests at heart. It's not too much to ask, and it's worth fighting for when that trust is violated. That's the lesson I learned from discovering that my HOA dues were funding the president's annual vacation. Receipts matched, evidence was clear, and justice, though slow, eventually prevailed. And in the end, our community emerged stronger, more engaged, and more determined to never let it happen again.